In the year 1167 AD, one of the most influential educational centers in the Western world forced a group of scholars to leave, and those scholars had nowhere to go. They were English. They had been studying in Paris when a political conflict between two kings ended their time there without warning. They packed their books, their notes, and their arguments, then looked across England for somewhere a community of serious scholars might survive. They needed lodgings they could afford, roads that connected them to the rest of the country, a location close enough to London to matter, but far enough away to think. They found a ford where oxen crossed a river. What grew beside that crossing, over the following 900 years, would help produce the antibiotic that saved tens of millions of lives. It would shape the political philosophy behind the American Constitution through the writings of John Locke, who studied and taught here. It would help develop a vaccine used by hundreds of millions of people during a global pandemic. And it would host a student debate in the 1930s, whose international significance was argued over for decades. It became one of the most influential universities in the world, and perhaps one of the most contradictory, a place that defended tradition while producing revolutionaries, a place that resisted reform while helping change entire societies, a place that often moved more slowly than the world around it, yet repeatedly helped reshape that world. Tonight, we are going back to the ford where they stopped. Chapter 1. The Ford and the Forgotten Town. There is a moment. If you stand on Folly Bridge in Oxford on a quiet morning and look west along the Thames, when the city behind you disappears entirely, the water moves slowly. Willows trail their branches into the current. The opposite bank is flat and green, stretching toward meadows that have looked roughly the same for a very long time. There are no dreaming spires from this angle, no ancient stone, just a river and two banks, and the particular stillness of a place that has been doing the same thing for centuries. What it has been doing is letting people cross. That is where Oxford begins. Not with a university or a castle or a cathedral, with a crossing, a specific point on a specific river where the water was shallow enough and the gravel bottom firm enough that you could move livestock and carts and people from one bank to the other without losing them to the current. That crossing is the oldest fact about Oxford, older than any building still standing, older than any document in any archive. The city grew around it, the way cities always grow, around the things people cannot do without. The Romans were here first, in any organized sense. They arrived in Britain in 43 AD under Emperor Claudius, and within a generation they had built the network of roads that would define movement across Britain for centuries. One of those roads crossed the Thames at a point near where Oxford now stands, and the archaeological evidence recovered from beneath and around the modern city confirms Roman activity in the area from the 1st century AD onward. A Roman settlement at a place now called Dorchester-on-Thames, a few miles to the southeast, served as an early administrative centre for the region. Pottery, coin, and the foundations of timber buildings have been recovered from sites across what is now the Oxford city area, confirming that this stretch of river was regularly used and regularly inhabited. But the Roman evidence does not show a significant town at Oxford itself. The Romans recognized the river crossing. They used it. They may have maintained a small way station in the vicinity. What they did not do was build anything at that specific location that grew into a major urban center. The big Roman towns of this region were elsewhere. Cirencester to the west, Dorchester to the southeast. Oxford, in the Roman period, was a useful point on a river, and nothing more. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something important about how Oxford actually came to exist. The city is not a Roman foundation that survived and grew. It is not a natural harbour or a mineral deposit or a royal birthplace that drew settlement by obvious logic. It is a place that became important slowly, almost accidentally, through a combination of geography and timing that nobody planned and nobody predicted. The Romans looked at this stretch of the Thames and saw a crossing. The people who came after them looked at the same stretch and eventually saw a city. The difference between those two ways of seeing took several centuries to develop. After the Romans withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, the infrastructure that had supported organized urban life began to deteriorate. The roads continued to be used, but the administrative systems that maintained them were gone. The towns that had depended on Roman commercial networks contracted. Britain entered a period that later historians would call the Dark Ages, a label that serious scholars now resist because it implies a simple collapse into chaos and ignorance, which is not what the evidence shows. What the evidence shows is a complicated transition, a gradual reorganization of society around different structures, different loyalties, and different ways of understanding the world. The people who moved into the Thames Valley in the 5th and 6th centuries spoke Germanic languages and came from what is now the coastline of Denmark and northwestern Germany. History calls them the Anglo-Saxons, though they were not a single unified group, but a shifting collection of peoples with related languages and broadly similar cultural practices. They were farmers and craftspeople and warriors. They were not, in any meaningful sense, urban people. They looked at the ruins of Roman towns and saw them with something close to awe, as the works of giants, as evidence of a vanished world they could not quite imagine. An Old English poem called The Ruin, preserved in the Exeter Book, held at Exeter Cathedral Library and dated to somewhere in the 8th or 9th century, describes a collapsed Roman city with a kind of grieving wonder. Walls still standing, roofs fallen, the men who built them long dead. So the Anglo-Saxons, for the most part, built somewhere else. In the area around the Thames crossing, they built villages and farmsteads on the gravel terraces that offered good drainage and productive soil. They cleared forest. They established patterns of agricultural settlement that would persist, in some cases, for more than 1,000 years. What they did not do, for several centuries, was establish anything at the river crossing itself that resembled a significant settlement. Then, sometime in the 7th century, something changed. A woman named Friedzweig, according to a tradition recorded in documents from the 12th century, founded a religious community at the place where Oxford now stands. The story that accumulated around her name has the texture of hagiography, the kind of devotional biography that medieval writers produced for saints, mixing historical memory with miracle and moral lesson. In the version that came to be widely accepted, Friedzweig was the daughter of a local ruler, a woman of exceptional piety who wished to dedicate her life to God. A prince pursued her as a prospective wife. She refused. She fled. She hid in a forest, or on a boat, depending on which version of the story you are reading. The prince was struck blind when he approached too closely. He recovered his sight when Friedzweig prayed for him. She eventually returned to Oxford and died there, with the most cautious historical estimates placing her death somewhere around 727 AD, though the precise date cannot be confirmed from surviving evidence. How much of this is historical fact and how much is pious elaboration is impossible to determine with certainty. What can be said with confidence is that Friedzweig was a real person, that she founded a religious community at Oxford, and that she was venerated as a saint very early after her death. Certainly by the 9th century, the community she founded became St. Friedzweig's Priory, located in what is now the centre of the city, on the site that eventually became Christ Church Cathedral. That thread of continuous religious community, from Friedzweig's 7th century foundation to a cathedral that stands and functions today, is one of the oldest institutional continuities in English history. It is also, in a way that historians find genuinely significant, the beginning of Oxford's habit of being defined by its institutions rather than by its geography. The ford across the Thames was a geographical fact. The priory that Fried's-White founded was a human choice. A decision to establish a place of prayer and community in a specific location, for reasons that went beyond the purely practical. It was the first of many such decisions that would, over the following centuries, accumulate into a city. But in the 7th century, that city was a very long way off. The settlement at the Oxford crossing was small, not particularly significant in the wider landscape of Anglo-Saxon England, and entirely unaware of the role it was going to play. The priory gave it a religious centre. The ford gave it a commercial purpose. The combination was enough to keep the place alive and to give it, in the eyes of the people who passed through, a character slightly more substantial than a simple way station. What would make it matter was going to come from outside, and it was going to arrive with fire and weapons and a level of organized violence that would force the settlement at the Thames crossing to become something it had never needed to be before. The Vikings were coming, and when they reached the bend in the river where Fried's-White had built her church, Oxford would have to decide very quickly what it was and whether it was worth defending. That decision, made under pressure in the 9th century, would shape everything that came after. The ford that oxen used to cross a river was about to become a city. Not because anyone planned it, because geography, once again, made it impossible to ignore. Chapter 2. Viking Fire and Alfred's Gamble. In the summer of 842 AD, a fleet of Viking ships moved up the Thames. They had done this before, to other rivers, in other parts of Britain and Ireland and the coastline of France. The Norse raiders, who began striking the shores of Britain in the 780s, had spent half a century learning that rivers were not barriers. Rivers were roads. Wide, navigable, deep enough for their shallow-drafted longships to travel far inland, far beyond the coastal defences that terrified populations had built in the hope of keeping them out. The Thames was one of the best roads in Britain. It ran straight into the heart of the most productive agricultural land in the country, past monasteries and trading settlements that had accumulated decades of portable wealth in silver and gold and fine cloth. For a Viking commander looking at a map of southern England, the Thames was an obvious target. What sat at the bend of the river, several miles inland, was an obvious stop. What happened to Oxford in 842 is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the remarkable historical document that Anglo-Saxon scholars began compiling in the late 9th century and continued updating for more than 200 years. The entry is brief, recording violence and destruction along the Thames. Oxford, referred to in the earliest documents as Oxnaford, appears in related records of this period as a settlement that suffered Viking attack. The precise details of what the raiders did when they reached the Thames crossing cannot be fully reconstructed from surviving evidence. But the pattern of Viking activity along the Thames in this period is well documented. They came for portable wealth. They burned what they could not take. They killed those who resisted and enslaved those who could be sold. The priory that Fried's-White had founded 2 centuries earlier was exactly the kind of target that Viking raiders preferred. It was a centre of religious community, which meant it had accumulated donations of silver and gold from pious benefactors over generations. Fine liturgical objects, manuscripts with decorated covers, the kind of portable concentrated wealth that raiders could carry back to their ships in an afternoon. The burning of monasteries and religious houses was not, for the Vikings, an act of particular religious hatred. It was an act of economic logic. They went where the wealth was. And in 9th century England, a very large proportion of the wealth was in religious houses. But here is what the violence of the 840s revealed about Oxford that nobody had quite recognized before. The place mattered. Not sentimentally, not religiously. It mattered in the cold strategic calculation of military geography. The crossing of the Thames at Oxford was, as the Romans had recognized 8 centuries earlier, and as the Vikings were now demonstrating with brutal clarity, a point that whoever controlled the river had to control. An enemy who held Oxford held the ability to move forces across the Thames at will. This was not a subtle insight. It was the kind of thing that becomes obvious the moment someone with military capability acts on it. And the Vikings had acted on it with characteristic directness. The response came from a man who is remembered by the English as the only monarch in their history to be called the Great. Alfred came to the throne of Wessex in 871 AD, under circumstances that suggested the title of king might prove to be a short and fatal honor. The Great Heathen Army, a confederation of Viking forces far larger and more organized than the raiding parties that had been terrorizing British coasts for decades, had already conquered Northumbria in the north, East Anglia in the east, and most of Mercia in the Midlands. Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, occupying what is now southern England, was the last significant English kingdom that had not fallen. Alfred had inherited a war he was not winning. In 878 AD, things reached their lowest point. A surprise Viking attack in January drove Alfred into hiding in the Somerset marshes with a small band of followers. The story of Alfred burning the cakes, distracted and scolded by a woman who did not recognize the king crouching over her fire, belongs to this period. Whether it is literally true cannot be confirmed from surviving evidence, but it survived because it captures something real about the situation. A king, reduced to nothing, hiding in a marsh, dependent on the charity of people who did not know who he was. Then Alfred came back. The military recovery that followed his emergence from the Somerset marshes in the spring of 878 is one of the most dramatic reversals in English history. He raised forces, defeated the Viking leader Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in May of 878, and negotiated the Treaty of Wedmore, which divided England between Alfred's Wessex and a Viking-controlled zone in the north and east that history knows as the Danelaw. The treaty bought time. Alfred used that time to completely rethink how England could be defended. His solution was a network of fortified towns that scholars call burhs, from the Old English word that eventually became borough. The idea was systematic, in a way that Anglo-Saxon military planning had never been before. Instead of responding to Viking attacks after they happened, Alfred planned to prevent them by ensuring that no place in Wessex was more than 20 miles from a fortified position. A document called the Burgel Hidage, compiled shortly after Alfred's death, lists 30 fortified places across Wessex and the territories Alfred controlled, each maintained by a specified number of men drawn from the surrounding agricultural land. Oxford appears on that list. Its inclusion was not accidental. Alfred or his advisors looked at the map of the Thames Valley and understood immediately what the Vikings had already demonstrated with fire and killing. Whoever controlled the crossing at Oxford controlled movement across the Thames in this part of England. A fortified town at Oxford was not optional. It was a strategic requirement. The burh that Alfred established at Oxford was laid out on a grid of streets that historians and archaeologists have spent decades tracing beneath the modern city. The plan was characteristically systematic. A roughly rectangular perimeter, defined by earthen banks and a ditch, enclosed an area large enough to house a garrison and a civilian population. Streets ran in an organized pattern. A marketplace was established. A mint was set up. Because coinage was a tool of royal authority and economic organization that Alfred understood was as important as military force. The grid that Alfred's planners laid out in Oxford in the late 9th century is still visible in the street plan of the modern city centre. The High Street, running east to west. Corn Market and St Aldate's, running north to south. The crossing at Carfax, from the Norman French word for crossroads, where those two main axes meet, is the centre that Alfred's town planners established more than 1100 years ago. When you stand at Carfax today and look down the 4 streets that radiate from it, you are standing at the geometric heart of a town plan that 9th century engineers drew on ground that was still scarred from Viking attacks. The modern tourist map of central Oxford, the map that millions of visitors use every year to navigate between the colleges and the Bodleian Library and the covered market, is essentially Alfred's military plan. The Victorians built on it. The medieval builders built on it. The Norman conquerors adapted it. But the underlying structure, the reason the streets run where they run, goes back to a king who needed to fortify a river crossing before the Vikings came back. Oxford appears in written historical records for the first time in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entry for 912 AD, which records that Edward the Elder, Alfred's son, took possession of the borough. This is the oldest surviving written reference to Oxford by name, confirming that by 912 Oxford was sufficiently established and important to be worth noting in a chronicle that recorded the major events of English political life. It was no longer just a ford. It was a borough, a place with walls and a mint and a market and a garrison and a name that appears in royal records. Alfred died in 899 AD, before the full consequences of what he had built could be seen. But his son Edward and his daughter Ethelfled, who governed Mercia with a capability that few rulers of the period could match, continued his strategy of fortified towns with ruthless consistency. Oxford, sitting on the frontier between Wessex and the contested Midlands, was a front-line position for much of this period, and the life of its inhabitants reflected that reality. Soldiers alongside merchants, the smell of a market town mixed with the routines of a garrison, a mint producing the coinage of a kingdom, simultaneously fighting for its survival and trying to build the infrastructure of a lasting state. Then, in the year 1002 AD, something happened at Oxford that the historical record preserves in enough detail to make it one of the most disturbing single events in the city's early history. The English king, Ethelred II, remembered by history under the nickname the Unready, meaning not that he was unprepared, but that he was poorly counselled, issued an order that November for the killing of all Danish men in England. The date was the Feast of St. Brice, which is why history records it as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, according to a royal charter issued by Ethelred 2 years afterward. The order was given out of a belief, apparently cultivated by advisors around the king, that Danish settlers within his kingdom were planning to betray him to Svein Forkbeard across the sea. At Oxford, a group of Danish settlers sought refuge inside St. Friedwide's priory, apparently believing that the sanctity of the religious building would protect them. It did not. The charter itself records that the Danes who had taken refuge in the church were burned alive when Oxford's population set fire to the building around them. The historical reality of the massacre in Oxford is not seriously disputed by scholars, and archaeological evidence has corroborated the written record in a striking way. Excavations carried out in the 1990s at St. John's College, near the site of the original Burr defences, uncovered a mass burial of between 34 and 38 individuals, mostly young adult males, with injuries consistent with violent death. Radiocarbon dating placed the burial in the late 10th or early 11th century, consistent with 102 AD. The bones of men who died violently in a coordinated killing had been lying beneath Oxford for 900 years before anyone found them. Ethelred's order did not prevent the Danish conquest he feared. Svein Forkbeard invaded England in 1013 AD and forced Ethelred into exile. Oxford submitted to Svein, along with most of the rest of England. When Svein died and Ethelred returned, Oxford was the location of a significant political assembly. The leading men of England gathered there and negotiated a new agreement between king and people. A moment that some historians read as an early step in the development of English constitutional thinking. The idea that a king's authority came with obligations that could be formally discussed and agreed. This is one of Oxford's less celebrated contributions to history. While the university that would eventually make the city famous was still more than a century away, the city was already functioning as a place where England's political business was conducted. A town built for defense had become, quietly and without anyone planning it, a town where the nation met itself and tried to work out what it was. By the time Edward the Confessor came to the throne in 1042 AD and began the reign that would end with the Norman conquest, Oxford was one of the most important towns in England. It had a mint, a market, multiple churches, a priori, and enough commercial and administrative activity to appear regularly in royal records. Oxford existed because it was convenient, and convenience, it turns out, is a more durable foundation for a city than glory or ambition or even faith. The Normans were about to discover that, and in discovering it, they were going to give Oxford something it had never had before. A moment of drama so strange, so perfectly cinematic, that it would be retold for 9 centuries without losing a single degree of its power. Chapter 3. The Normans, the Castle, and the Empress in the Snow. On Christmas Day of 1066 AD, in Westminster Abbey, a Norman duke was crowned King of England. The ceremony almost collapsed before it began. The soldiers standing guard outside heard the congregation shout their acclamation in the traditional manner and assumed something had gone wrong inside. They began setting fire to nearby buildings. The coronation of William I started with an accidental arson. It was, in retrospect, a fitting beginning for a reign that would transform England through a combination of ruthless efficiency and barely contained violence. William spent the years after his coronation doing what every conqueror does. He built things to make clear who was in charge. Stone things, massive and expensive and visible from a long distance, that said the same thing in every direction simultaneously. You are being watched. You are being controlled. The man who built these walls is not going anywhere. At Oxford, his agents built a castle. Oxford Castle was begun in 1071 AD, 5 years after the conquest. On the western edge of the existing town, the castle sat at the point where the Thames and one of its tributaries converged, giving it a natural water defense on 2 sides. But it did not face outward, toward the river and the countryside beyond. Like the Tower of London, which William was building in the same years on the southeastern edge of the capital, Oxford Castle was positioned to face inward. Its towers and walls commanded the town behind them. The message was the same message the Tower of London delivered to the people of the capital, just directed at a smaller and somewhat less strategically critical audience. You are being watched. We are here. We are not leaving. The mound on which the castle's central tower stood, a motte in the terminology of Norman military architecture, was built by forced labor from the surrounding population, piling earth to a height of more than 60 feet in a matter of weeks. You could see that mound from most of the town. You could not forget it was there. That was the point. The mound still exists. If you visit Oxford today and walk to the western edge of the city centre, you will find Castle Mound, now a green hill rising above a complex of converted Victorian prison buildings that house a hotel and a heritage experience. Children climb it on weekend afternoons. Tourists photograph the view from the top. On a clear day, you can see a surprising amount of the city from its summit, which is exactly what the Norman garrison could see from the tower that stood there 950 years ago. Most visitors have no idea what they are standing on. The Norman conquest brought more than castles to Oxford. It brought a new ruling class, a new language at the top of the social hierarchy, and a wholesale restructuring of how land was owned and controlled. The Domesday Survey of 1086 AD, the great inventory that William commissioned to understand precisely what his conquest had acquired, records Oxford in revealing detail. The town had suffered significantly in the years immediately following the conquest, with many properties recorded as waste, a term meaning depopulated and generating no revenue. Norman castle construction, which required clearing existing buildings and relocating their inhabitants, was one reason. The general disruption of conquest was another. But Oxford recovered, as it always recovered, because the geography that made it useful had not changed. The Thames crossing was still there. The roads that converged on it were still the most convenient routes across the river for a wide area. The market that traders used was still the most accessible in the region. Within a generation of the conquest, Oxford was functioning again, its streets busy with commerce, its mint producing coinage, its religious houses rebuilding and expanding. The cathedral priory of St. Fried's-Wide was refounded and rebuilt in the late 11th and early 12th centuries on a grander scale than before, in the Romanesque style that the Normans brought with them from France. Round arches and massive walls, and a solidity designed to express the permanence of Norman power as much as the glory of God. Parts of that 12th century building survive in the structure of Christ Church Cathedral today, embedded in walls that millions of people walk past without knowing they are looking at stone cut 900 years ago. The town that Oxford was becoming in the late 11th and early 12th centuries was more complex and more contested than the simple narrative of Norman conquest and Saxon submission would suggest. Norman settlers and administrators sat at the top of the social hierarchy. English craftsmen and traders occupied the middle. A Jewish community established itself in Oxford, as it did in other significant English towns in the Norman period, playing an important role in the financial life of the town. The streets of Norman Oxford contained people speaking Old English and Norman French and Latin and Hebrew, conducting business in multiple languages across the social and religious boundaries that officially divided them. From its Norman phase, Oxford was already a place of multiple worlds, pressed into one set of streets. Henry I, William the Conqueror's youngest son, died in 1135 AD, after a reign of 35 years that had been, by the standards of medieval English governance, relatively stable. But the stability had a crack running through its foundation. Henry's only legitimate son, William Adelin, had drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120 AD. When a vessel carrying the heir to the English throne and many of the leading figures of Anglo-Norman society struck a rock off the port of Barfleur and sank with almost no survivors. Henry had spent the last 15 years of his reign trying to secure the succession for his daughter Matilda, a formidable woman who had been Holy Roman Empress through her first marriage and who her father believed was capable of ruling England. Most of the English barons disagreed, not because they had a specific legal objection to female rule, though some did, but because Matilda was demanding and undiplomatic in ways that medieval kingship required one not to be. When Henry died, his nephew Stephen of Blois moved fast. He crossed the Channel, secured the royal treasury, and was crowned king at Westminster within weeks of Henry's death. He had the speed and the political instinct that Matilda lacked in those crucial weeks. What followed was 19 years of civil war between Stephen and Matilda that contemporaries called the Anarchy, a period so devastating to ordinary life in England that contemporary chroniclers described it in terms of near-apocalyptic suffering. England was broken, and Oxford was at the center of the breaking. The city changed hands multiple times during the anarchy. Stephen took it. Matilda took it back. Stephen besieged it. The castle became the focal point of the conflict in the Thames Valley, each side using it as their base when they controlled it and attacking it furiously when they did not. In the summer of 1142 AD, Matilda was in Oxford Castle. She had been there for some time, using it as her base while fighting for control of the kingdom she believed was rightfully hers. Stephen's forces had closed around Oxford and begun a formal siege. The town was surrounded. The garrison was cut off. The food supplies that would sustain the defenders were being eaten week by week, and no relief army was coming in time. The siege lasted approximately 3 months. By December of 1142 AD, the situation inside the castle had become critical. The food was running out. Stephen's forces showed no sign of withdrawing. Matilda was trapped inside her own stronghold, in the middle of winter, with no obvious means of escape. What she did next is one of those historical moments so precisely cinematic that it is tempting to wonder whether it has been improved in the telling over 9 centuries. The evidence suggests it has not. The core of what happened is confirmed by multiple contemporary sources, including the chronicler William of Malmesbury, writing within decades of the events. The Thames that winter had frozen over. The ice was thick enough to walk on. Matilda and a small group of companions left the castle in the middle of the night. They were dressed, according to William of Malmesbury's account, in white cloaks, to camouflage themselves against the snow that lay on the ice and the frozen fields beyond. They walked across the frozen river. They passed through or around Stephen's encircling forces in the dark. They reached the other bank. They walked several miles through the winter night to Abingdon, where horses were waiting, and from Abingdon they rode to safety. Stephen's forces entered the castle the following day to find it abandoned. Hold that image for a moment. A woman who had been Holy Roman Empress, who believed with complete conviction that she was the rightful ruler of England, walking across a frozen river in the middle of the night in a white cloak, surrounded by soldiers who would have killed her if they had seen her, because it was the only move left on the board. No armies, no cavalry charge, no dramatic last stand, just white cloth against white snow, and footsteps on ice, and the cold dark of a December night in 12th century England. It is one of the most remarkable acts of personal survival in the history of this city. It is also, in the long run, a story about losing. Matilda never became ruler of England in any settled, recognized sense. The anarchy eventually ended not with her victory, but with a compromise. The Treaty of Wallingford in 1153 AD, by which Stephen agreed to recognize Matilda's son Henry as his heir. Stephen died the following year. Henry became Henry II. Oxford had been devastated by the years of fighting, but the castle was still there. The crossing was still there, and something else was happening in Oxford. Something that the chaos of the anarchy had interrupted but not destroyed. Something that would prove far more consequential than any of the battles fought over the town's stone walls. Scholars had been coming to Oxford. Not in large numbers yet, not in any organized or institutionally recognized way, but the combination of factors that made Oxford useful for armies, the road network, the river crossing, the central location, also made it accessible for travelers of every kind. And, increasingly, men who wanted to study and teach were finding their way to Oxford and discovering that others like them were already there. The religious houses of Oxford, rebuilt and expanded in the Norman period, provided both the tradition of learning and the physical infrastructure of libraries and scriptoria that scholarly activity required. The town provided lodgings, food, and enough commercial activity to support a community of people who spent their days reading and arguing. The location, close to London and to the major ecclesiastical centres of southern England, but sufficiently removed from the immediate noise of royal politics, made it the kind of place where a person could actually concentrate on the work of thinking. The scholars were coming. What would turn their quiet accumulation into something the Western world had never quite seen before was still a generation away. But the conditions were assembling themselves, quietly and without announcement, in the streets of a town that was simultaneously recovering from a devastating civil war and becoming, without anyone planning it, the intellectual centre of England. Chapter 4. The birth of the university, and why it happened here. In the year 1167 AD, an English king and a French king had an argument, and Oxford accidentally became one of the major intellectual engines of the Western world. The argument was not about Oxford. It was not about education. It was about Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, whom Henry II had appointed, fallen out with catastrophically, and would eventually, in a moment of furious rhetoric that he may or may not have meant literally, have murdered in his own cathedral. The dispute between Henry and Becket had drawn in the Pope, the French king Louis VII, and the entire machinery of medieval ecclesiastical politics. One of its consequences, in 1167, was that Henry pressured Louis to expel English scholars from the University of Paris, which was at that time among the most prestigious centres of learning in the Western world. The scholars left Paris. They needed somewhere to go. They needed somewhere with books, lodgings, enough food to sustain a community of people who spent their days reading and arguing rather than farming or fighting, and access to the road networks that would allow students and teachers to reach them from across England. Oxford had all of those things. This is the founding moment of the University of Oxford, and it is worth being precise about what that means and what it does not mean. There was no ceremony. There was no charter. No king or pope sat down on a specific day and declared that a university would henceforth exist at Oxford. What happened was more organic and in some ways more interesting. A critical mass of scholars who had been scattered across various locations in England suddenly needed to concentrate somewhere. Oxford was the most logical place. They concentrated there, and the concentration, once it reached sufficient density, became self-sustaining. This matters because it explains something distinctive about Oxford that has shaped its character ever since. The University of Paris was founded by a papal charter. The University of Bologna, the oldest in Europe, organized itself around a specific legal and institutional framework. Oxford grew from the bottom up, from the accumulation of individual scholars and students who found each other useful and built informal structures to manage their shared needs. The result was an institution with a deep instinct for self-governance and a deep suspicion of external authority, whether royal or papal or governmental. That instinct would cause enormous amounts of trouble over the following 9 centuries. It would also produce some of the most important intellectual work in the history of Western civilization. By the 1180s and 1190s, Oxford had accumulated enough scholars to require organization. The men who taught were beginning to call themselves masters. The men who studied under them were beginning to organize into groups. A figure called a chancellor was emerging as the person responsible for maintaining order and representing the scholarly community to the outside world. None of these developments happened overnight. They accumulated across several decades, each small step toward institutional structure, making the next step slightly more natural. What drove the organizational process forward was, characteristically for Oxford, a conflict. The relationship between the scholars who had come to Oxford and the townspeople who housed fed, and supplied them was difficult from the very beginning. The tension had a structural logic that made it almost inevitable. The scholars needed lodgings, food, firewood, candles, parchment, ink, and all the other materials of daily life and scholarly work. The townspeople who provided these things had an obvious incentive to charge as much as the market would bear. The scholars, many of whom were living on limited stipends or the charity of patrons, had an equally obvious incentive to pay as little as possible. Into this economic conflict were layered legal differences, because the scholars claimed exemption from the town's courts, arguing that as clerics they should be subject to ecclesiastical rather than civil jurisdiction. The townspeople found this arrangement maddening. These disputes were not occasional. They were structural. They happened constantly, generating a slow accumulation of mutual resentment that periodically exploded into open violence. The most dramatic explosion came in February of 1355 AD. On St. Scholastica's Day, it began, in the way that the most historically significant events sometimes do, with a complaint about wine. Two students at a tavern called the Swindlestock Inn, on the corner of what is now the High Street and Corn Market, told the landlord that his wine was substandard. When the landlord responded in a way they found unsatisfactory, the argument escalated rapidly. Students' friends arrived. The townspeople's friends arrived. Within hours, what had started as a dispute about the quality of a drink had become a running battle through the streets of Oxford between the town's population and the university's scholars. The fighting lasted 3 days. On the second day, a mob of townspeople and people from the surrounding countryside, summoned by the ringing of St. Martin's church bell, attacked the university's halls and hostels. According to contemporary accounts, including the chronicle of Henry Knighton writing within living memory of the events, scholars were dragged from their lodgings and beaten in the streets. Books and furniture were thrown into the road. When the fighting finally ended, the death toll on both sides was severe, with contemporary sources recording losses in the dozens on each side, though the precision of medieval casualty counts should always be treated with appropriate caution. What happened next reveals more about the medieval relationship between royal power and institutional privilege than almost any other episode in Oxford's history. The king, Edward III, sided firmly with the university. The town was fined. Its officers were required to swear an oath acknowledging the university's privileges. And for the following 470 years, until 1825 AD, the mayor of Oxford was required on St. Scholastica's Day to attend a service at St. Mary's Church, the university church, and to pay a formal fine in acknowledgement of the town's conduct. 470 years of annual institutional apology for a bar fight that got out of hand. This is Oxford, where the consequences of events last longer than any of the participants could have imagined, and where institutional memory is so long that it sometimes outlasts the meaning of the thing being remembered. But the St. Scholastica's Day riot, dramatic and appalling as it was not the most consequential product of the tension between town and gown. That honour belongs to something that emerged from the very practical problem of where scholars were going to live. In the early years of Oxford's scholarly community, students and masters had lived in dispersed lodgings throughout the town, renting rooms from local families, gathering in churches and hired halls to hear lectures. This arrangement was cheap and flexible, but provided no stability, no security, and no mechanism for maintaining scholarly standards across the community. Rich students could afford reasonable accommodation. Poor students lived in conditions that made sustained study difficult. The solution that emerged was the college. The idea was not invented at Oxford. It had precedents in the hospices that supported poor scholars at Paris and other European universities. But Oxford developed it into something distinctive. an autonomous residential community with its own chapel, library, hall, and endowment, governed by its own statutes and accountable primarily to its own internal rules. The key feature was the endowment. A college that owned property and received rents from that property was not dependent on the goodwill of patrons or the financial health of individual students. It could sustain itself and sustain the scholars within it, across generations. The first colleges at Oxford were founded in the second half of the 13th century. Merton College, whose statutes of 1264 AD represent the first fully worked-out model of the collegiate system, is generally regarded as the template from which the others developed. Balliol College, founded by most accounts around 1263 AD, though some sources place its origins earlier, and University College, which claims a foundation date of 1249 AD, though historians generally date its effective foundation to later in the century, are also among the earliest. Each was founded by a wealthy patron who endowed it with property whose revenues would permanently support a community of scholars. Walter de Merton, the royal official who founded Merton College and wrote its statutes, understood something important. He was not just founding a school. He was creating a self-perpetuating institution, a community that would continue to exist and continue to produce educated men long after he was dead. The statutes he wrote were designed to prevent the college from being captured by any individual interest, including his own family's. Merton College, founded more than 760 years ago, still exists and still functions and still uses a version of the governance structure that Walter de Merton designed. While the college system was developing, Oxford was also producing individual thinkers whose work would have consequences far beyond the medieval world in which they lived. Robert Grosseteste, who lectured at Oxford in the early 13th century and became the first chancellor of the university, was one of the important intellectual figures of medieval Europe. His work on optics and light, his engagement with the relationship between mathematics and the natural world, and his interest in testing claims about nature through observation, place him as one early and significant figure in what would eventually become the Western empirical tradition. He was not a scientist in the modern sense. He was a bishop and a theologian working within the framework of medieval Christian thought. But the questions he was asking, and the methods he was beginning to develop for answering them, pointed towards something that his world did not yet have a name for. Roger Bacon, who studied and taught at Oxford in the mid-13th century, pushed those questions further. He conducted experiments with lenses and mirrors. He wrote speculatively about mechanical flight and self-propelled vehicles. He was controversial in his own time, suspected of dangerous knowledge, and he spent years under a form of restriction imposed by his Franciscan superiors. Both Grosseteste and Bacon were Oxford men. Oxford was, from its earliest decades, one of the places in medieval Europe where the empirical approach to understanding the natural world was being actively developed and defended. By the mid-13th century, Oxford was recognized across Europe as one of the significant centers of learning. The Franciscan and Dominican friars, the two great preaching orders of the medieval church, established their houses in Oxford and sent their most promising scholars there. Scholars from across England and from the continent found their way to the town on the Thames. The colleges were being founded and endowed. The libraries were growing. Oxford had become, within a century of its accidental founding, one of the major intellectual engines of the Western world. It had done so through a riot, a royal expulsion, a collection of endowments, and the slow accumulation of people who found each other useful, not through a plan, not through a vision, through the particular combination of geography, political accident, and human stubbornness that characterizes almost every genuinely significant development in this city's history. The scholars who had been expelled from Paris and needed somewhere to go had found a ford where oxen crossed a river. What they built there, over the following century, was one of the most consequential institutions in human history. They had no idea that was what they were doing. That, too, is very Oxford. Chapter 5. Plague, Wycliffe, and the dangerous idea. In the spring of 1349 AD, Oxford began to empty. It did not empty because the students left, though many of them did. It did not empty because the colleges closed, though several of them effectively ceased to function. It emptied because the people who filled it were dying, quickly and in large numbers, and in ways that made no sense to anyone trying to understand what was happening. The disease that arrived in Oxford in the spring of 1349 had already been working its way across Europe for 2 years. It had entered England through the ports of the south coast in the summer of 1348, probably carried in the fleas on rats, on merchant ships coming from the continent, though the precise mechanism of transmission was not understood by anyone living through it. It moved northward and inland through the autumn, reaching London and then spreading outward along the road networks that connected the major towns of England. Oxford was exactly the kind of place that the disease found most useful. A town of perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 people, densely settled, with a significant transient population of students living in close quarters in lodging houses and college halls. The streets were narrow, clean water was scarce, rats were abundant. The conditions for rapid transmission were close to ideal, working from parish records, wills, and the records of ecclesiastical appointments. Historians have estimated that somewhere between 1/3 and half of Oxford's population died during the initial outbreak of 1349, though the uncertainty in those numbers reflects the genuine difficulty of reconstructing mortality from incomplete medieval records. The colleges lost fellows and students. The religious houses lost monks and canons. The town lost merchants and craftsmen and labourers. The university, which had established itself as one of the significant intellectual centres of Europe, suddenly found its lecture halls empty and its teaching programs suspended. The physical evidence is in the ground beneath the city. Archaeological excavations at various points across Oxford have confirmed the disruption that the written record describes. Property boundaries shift. Building sequences are interrupted. The careful accumulation of material culture that characterizes normal urban life simply stops in certain places and certain periods, as if the people who were doing the accumulating suddenly ceased to exist. They had. What the Black Death did to Oxford was not only a matter of immediate mortality. Catastrophic as that was, it did something more slowly and more profoundly disruptive. The institutions that had been built over the previous century and a half, the colleges, with their endowments and their statutes and their carefully maintained communities of scholars, were designed to sustain themselves across generations. The Black Death killed so many people so quickly that the mechanisms of institutional continuity were overwhelmed. Masters who had trained the next generation of teachers were dead. Students who would have gone on to teach and write and govern were dead. The accumulated knowledge and expertise that lived in specific people, rather than in books, was simply gone. The recovery was slow and painful. The plague returned in 1361, and again in 1369, and at intervals through the rest of the 14th century and into the 15th. Each return disrupted the rebuilding process and reminded the survivors that the world they had known before 1348 was gone and was not coming back. Into this disrupted and frightened world came a man who would do more to change the religious life of England, and ultimately of Europe, than any other figure Oxford has ever produced. John Wycliffe arrived at Oxford sometime in the 1340s. possibly before the Black Death. Certainly young enough that he spent his formative intellectual years in a university shaped by the plague's aftermath. He was born in Yorkshire, the son of a minor landowner, and he came to Oxford on the standard medieval trajectory of a clever young man from a modest background who needed education to advance in the world. He studied the standard curriculum. He became a Fellow of Merton College. He eventually became Master of Balliol College. He was, by the standards of his time and his field, a successful and recognized academic. He was also, increasingly, furious. The fury had specific targets. He was furious at the wealth of the church, which had accumulated enormous landholdings and revenues, while the peasants who worked that land lived in poverty. He was furious at the corruption of the clergy, priests and bishops who used their positions for personal enrichment rather than spiritual service. He was furious at what he saw as the theological errors that centuries of church tradition had layered on top of the simpler faith he found in the text of the Bible itself. And he was furious at the system that kept that text locked in Latin, accessible only to the educated, unavailable to the ordinary men and women whose souls it was supposed to save. His fury produced ideas, and his ideas, worked out in the lectures and disputations and written treatises that were the normal medium of Oxford academic life, were among the most unsettling that medieval Europe had produced. His central argument was deceptively simple. Authority in the church derived from God, not from institutional hierarchy. A priest who was in mortal sin had no spiritual authority, regardless of his institutional position. The Pope himself had no special claim on Christian obedience beyond what his personal holiness entitled him to. This argument, worked out with considerable philosophical sophistication across a series of treatises written in the 1360s and 1370s, pulled at the thread that held the entire structure of medieval Catholicism together. If institutional authority was not self-validating, then the whole edifice of papal power and clerical privilege rested on foundations that could be questioned. Wycliffe questioned them, publicly, in writing. At Oxford, his criticisms found an unlikely protector in John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster and one of the most powerful noblemen in England during the minority and early reign of Richard II. John of Gaunt had his own reasons to welcome attacks on church wealth. His protection gave Wycliffe a degree of political cover that would otherwise have been unavailable to an Oxford academic picking fights with the institutional church. But Wycliffe went further than even John of Gaunt was entirely comfortable with. He attacked the doctrine of transubstantiation. He attacked the practice of confession to priests. He attacked the veneration of saints. He attacked, in short, almost every distinctive feature of medieval Catholic practice, arguing that each was a human invention substituted for the direct relationship between the individual Christian and God that the Bible described. And then he did the thing that frightened his opponents most. He organized the translation of the entire Bible into English. The Wycliffe Bible, produced in the 1380s by Wycliffe and his associates, was not the first time portions of the scriptures had been rendered into English, but it was the first complete translation of the entire Christian scriptures into the English language. A project that originated in Oxford and whose implications were enormous and immediately understood by everyone who thought about them carefully. A Bible in Latin was a controlled text. Only those educated in Latin could read it. The Church could therefore maintain a degree of control over how the text was interpreted and what it was understood to mean. A Bible in English was a text that any literate person could read. In a period when literacy was spreading beyond the exclusively clerical class, Wycliffe's Bible was the theological equivalent of opening a locked room. The Church understood exactly what this meant. The Archbishop of Canterbury condemned his teachings. Attempts were made to have him tried for heresy. He survived these attempts, partly through John of Gaunt's protection and partly through the genuine difficulty of prosecuting an Oxford academic on heresy charges, when the university had a long-standing tradition of protecting its scholars from external interference. He was eventually removed from his academic position, but he continued to write until a stroke in 1382 left him partially paralysed. He died at Lutterworth in Leicestershire in 1384 AD. His followers, known as Lollards, continued spreading his ideas through England for decades after his death. They were not a tiny fringe group. The Lollard movement attracted significant support among the literate urban population. The merchants and craftsmen and minor gentry who were exactly the people Wycliffe's translation was meant to reach. They copied and distributed the English Bible. They held informal meetings to read and discuss scripture without clerical supervision. They were doing, a century before Martin Luther, what Luther is usually credited with beginning. The institutional response was the statute known as De Heretico Comburendo, passed by Parliament in 1401 AD, which formalized burning as the official judicial punishment for convicted heretics in England and was aimed explicitly at Lollards. It suppressed the movement's public expression and drove it underground. It did not eliminate the ideas. The Church's response to Wycliffe himself went further. The Council of Constance, in 1415 AD, declared him a heretic posthumously. His books were to be burned, and the council ordered that his remains be exhumed and destroyed. This was carried out in 1428 AD, 44 years after Wycliffe's death. His bones were dug up from the churchyard at Lutterworth, burned, and his ashes thrown into the River Swift. A later writer observed that the river carried Wycliffe's ashes into the Avon into the Severn into the sea, and the sea around the whole world. The image was intended as a comment on the futility of trying to suppress ideas by destroying the physical remains of the person who had them. It is also a surprisingly accurate description of what actually happened. Wycliffe's ideas had already spread to Bohemia, where Jan Hus built on them and was burned alive for doing so, and from Hus, through a chain of influence and reaction that historians can trace in detail. The thread runs to Martin Luther in Germany in 1517 AD, and to the Protestant Reformation that changed the religious map of the Western world permanently. The Reformation began in an important censor, in an Oxford lecture hall in the mid-14th century. The man who started it was teaching at Oxford during the years when the city was still recovering from the worst epidemic in recorded history. The intellectual ferment that the plague's disruption of old certainties had created. The anger at an institution that had accumulated wealth and power while its members died alongside everyone else. All of that was part of the soil in which Wycliffe's ideas grew. Oxford educated Wycliffe. Wycliffe challenged the theological foundations of the institution that educated him. The Church tried to destroy Wycliffe's legacy. The legacy spread anyway. This pattern would repeat itself many times in the centuries to come. Oxford has always been most dangerous to the established order, precisely when it believes it is serving it. Chapter 6. The Reformation comes to Oxford. In flames. On a morning in October of 1555 AD, two men were led out of the prison where they had been held for months and walked through the streets of Oxford to a place near the north gate of the city called Broad Street. Their names were Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley. Latimer was in his late 70s, old by the standards of his time, a former Bishop of Worcester who had been one of the most popular preachers in England during the reign of Henry VIII. Ridley was younger, the former Bishop of London, a careful theologian who had helped shape the doctrinal framework of the Church of England under Henry's son, Edward VI. Both men had been powerful figures in the English Church. Both had held high office. Both had, at various points in their careers, used that office to imprison and persecute people whose religious views differed from the officially approved position of the moment. Neither of those facts saved them now. They were tied to a stake. The wood was piled around them. Before the fire was lit, Latimer turned to Ridley and spoke words that were later recorded by the Protestant writer John Foxe in his Acts and Monuments. Published in 1563 AD, Foxe was not a neutral witness. His book was Protestant writing of considerable rhetorical power, shaped by the purposes for which it was written. Whether Latimer's exact words were precisely as Foxe recorded them is something the surviving evidence cannot confirm with certainty. According to Foxe's account, Latimer said that they would, that day, light such a candle in England as would, he trusted, never be put out. What is confirmed by multiple sources, including accounts that were not written from a Protestant perspective, is that both men were burned at Broad Street in October of 1555, that the event was witnessed by a large crowd, and that it left a mark on Oxford that has never entirely faded. 5 months later, on the 21st of March, 1556 AD, a third man was burned at the same spot. His name was Thomas Cranmer. He had been Archbishop of Canterbury, the most senior figure in the Church of England that Henry VIII had created. He had written the Book of Common Prayer, the liturgical text that defined Anglican worship and whose prose influenced the way educated English speakers wrote and thought for generations. He had also, under pressure and in fear of death, signed a series of recantations of his Protestant beliefs, formally accepting Catholic doctrine in the hope that this submission would save his life. It did not save his life. Queen Mary I, the Catholic daughter of Henry VIII, who had come to the throne in 1553 and was determined to return England to Rome, had decided that Cranmer would burn regardless of what he signed. When Cranmer understood this, he did something that nobody had predicted, and that transformed his execution into a scene that has been retold ever since. At the stake, before the fire was lit, contemporary accounts describe him thrusting his right hand into the flames first, the hand that had signed the recantations, and holding it there while speaking words of repentance for having recanted his beliefs. Whether this is precisely what happened, or whether the story was shaped in the retelling to give his death a particular moral shape, is a question that historians continue to examine carefully. The core of the event is confirmed. Cranmer was burned at Broad Street. He died at the same location where Latimer and Ridley had died 5 months earlier. The 3 men burned on Broad Street are known as the Oxford Martyrs, a tall stone monument. The Martyrs' Memorial was erected in 1841 AD near the spot where they died, a neo-Gothic spire rising above the intersection where Beaumont Street meets St. Giles. You can see it today, slightly grimed by city traffic, often used as a meeting point by students who pay it almost no attention. Most of them could not tell you who it commemorates without looking at the inscription. But the story of the Oxford Martyrs is more complicated than a monument to Protestant heroism suggests. Latimer and Ridley and Cranmer were not simple victims. They were men who had wielded considerable power in an era when religious policy was enforced with violence, and they had not always been on the side of mercy. Cranmer had overseen the burning of a man named John Lambert in 1538 AD for denying the doctrine of transubstantiation, the same doctrine for which Cranmer himself would eventually burn. Ridley had participated in the condemnation of Joan Bocher, a radical Protestant, burned in 1550 AD. These men understood, from personal experience, exactly what they were facing on Broad Street. They had been part of the system that produced such deaths. Now, the system was producing their own. This does not make their deaths less significant or less terrible. It makes them more complicated. And complicated is what Oxford's religious history in the 16th century actually was. To understand why the Reformation came to Oxford in the particular form it did, you have to understand what Henry VIII did to the city before any of the burnings took place. Henry's break with Rome in 1534 AD was not primarily a theological event. It was a political and financial one. He wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon. The Pope refused. Henry removed the English Church from papal authority, declared himself its supreme head, and proceeded to dismantle the institutional structures that had connected England to Rome for nearly 1,000 years. The dissolution of the monasteries, carried out between 1536 and 1540 AD, was the most physically dramatic consequence of this decision, and Oxford felt it with particular force. The city contained multiple religious houses, each woven into the fabric of Oxford life for centuries. Osney Abbey, just outside the western walls of the city, was one of the most significant Augustinian monasteries in England. The Franciscan Friary, the Dominican Friary, the Augustinian Friary, the Carmelite Friary, each had provided education, hospitality, care for the sick and poor, and a significant proportion of the teaching that made Oxford a university rather than just a collection of buildings. Within a few years, all of them were gone. The dissolution was devastating in human terms for the communities it destroyed. Men and women who had given their lives to religious vocation woke one morning to find that vocation legally terminated. Their institutions seized, their futures uncertain. But it had a consequence for Oxford that Henry had not planned and may not have fully anticipated. The dissolution of the religious houses released an enormous amount of prime Oxford property onto the market. Land that had been held by religious institutions for centuries was suddenly available, and some of the men who bought it were reformers who saw in the physical assets of the dissolved monasteries the raw material for something new. Henry himself established what would become Christ Church in 1546 AD, built on the site of the former St. Friedeswide's Priory. The Cathedral Church of St. Friedeswide became simultaneously the chapel of the new college and the Cathedral Church of the newly created Diocese of Oxford, one building serving two institutional purposes. A characteristic Oxford solution to competing demands. Christ Church was and remains the largest and in many ways the most architecturally imposing college in Oxford. Its great quadrangle, Tom Quad, is the largest in Oxford. Its tower, completed in 1682 AD by Christopher Wren, and housing the bell called Great Tom, whose tolling each evening signals the closing of college gates, is one of the defining features of the Oxford skyline. By most counts, it educated more prime ministers of the United Kingdom than any other Oxford college. It produced John Locke, whose political philosophy shaped the American Constitution. It produced W.H. Auden. It produced Lewis Carroll, who wrote the Alice books for the daughter of the Dean of Christ Church, and set the underground world of that story in a tradition of Oxford nonsense and wordplay that the institution has always quietly nurtured alongside its grandeur, ambition. All of that grew from the ruins of a dissolved priory that Henry VIII rebuilt to demonstrate his reformed faith and his royal power simultaneously. Under Edward VI, who came to the throne as a child in 1547 AD and ruled until his death in 1553, the English Church moved sharply in a Protestant direction. Altars were replaced by communion tables. Stained glass was smashed. Religious images were removed. The Latin Mass was abolished and replaced by the English liturgy of Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer. When Mary came to the throne in 1553 and began the reversal of the Protestant reforms, Oxford became the location she chose for the formal heresy trials of the three men who most visibly represented the Edwardian Church. The choice of Oxford was not accidental. Heresy trials in a university city carried a specific message. These were not just criminals being punished. These were intellectuals whose ideas were being officially condemned in the place where intellectual authority was most concentrated. The burnings on Broad Street were a statement about the relationship between institutional religion and intellectual freedom that Oxford would spend the next 5 centuries processing. But Mary's reign lasted only 5 years. When she died in 1558 and her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth came to the throne, the religious pendulum swung back. The Elizabethan settlement of 1559 AD established the Church of England on a broadly Protestant theological basis, while preserving enough of the outward forms to make it acceptable to the majority of the population. It was a political compromise, dressed in theological language. And, like most political compromises, it satisfied almost nobody completely. For Oxford, the Elizabethan settlement created a particular role. The university became a training ground for the clergy of the new established church, a place where the theological identity of Anglicanism was worked out through preaching and teaching, and the kind of intense academic argument that Oxford had been conducting since the 13th century. The fellows and students of Oxford's colleges were required to subscribe to the 39 Articles, the doctrinal statement of the Church of England, and the university's governance was tied to the institutional church in ways that would persist until the 19th century. This relationship had profound consequences for who could study at Oxford and who could not. Catholics were excluded. Nonconformists were excluded. Jews were excluded. The university that in the 13th century had been open, in principle at least, to any scholar with sufficient ability and funds, was progressively narrowing its social base, turning itself into a training institution for the English Protestant establishment at exactly the moment when that establishment was extending its authority over an expanding empire. But something else happened in Oxford in this period that is easy to miss amid the drama of burnings and dissolutions and religious reversals. In 1602 AD, a man named Thomas Bodley began restocking the university's long-neglected library. The original university library had been given a significant collection of manuscripts by Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, in the 1430s. That collection had been stripped during the Edwardian Reformation, when a commission concluded that many of its manuscripts were popish and therefore dangerous. The shelves that Humphrey had filled were empty. The furniture had been sold. Bodley was a retired diplomat who had accumulated both the wealth and the connections to undertake something significant. His intention was not to create a library for the exclusive use of Oxford scholars. His intention was to create a library for the use of the Republic of Letters, the international community of scholars across Europe who shared books, ideas, and correspondence in the common language of Latin, regardless of the national and religious boundaries that divided them politically. The Bodleian Library was opened in 1602 AD, with around 2,000 volumes. Bodley negotiated an agreement with the Stationers' Company, the guild that controlled book printing in England, requiring them to deposit a copy of every book printed in England in the library. This deposit agreement, the ancestor of the legal deposit requirement that still operates today, meant that the Bodleian would grow automatically with every book the English press produced. A library, depending on donations, would always be incomplete. A library with a legal right to every printed book would eventually contain everything. The Bodleian today holds more than 13 million items. It is one of the oldest libraries in Europe still in continuous operation, and one of the 6 legal deposit libraries in the United Kingdom, meaning that a copy of every book published in the country still arrives on its shelves. Bodley built it in a city that had just spent half a century burning books, and the people who wrote them. That juxtaposition, the flames of Broad Street and the shelves of the Bodleian growing steadily fuller on the street a few hundred yards away, is one of the truest images of what Oxford actually is. A place where destruction and preservation, violence and scholarship, the worst of human institutional behavior and the best of human intellectual ambition, exist, not in sequence, but simultaneously, in the same city, sometimes on the same street, sometimes in the same year. The Reformation had come to Oxford in flames. What Oxford built from those flames was, characteristically, both more complicated and more enduring than anyone who lit them had intended. The century ahead would bring a king who made Oxford his capital, a civil war that turned the college gardens into gunpowder magazines, and a group of scientists who kept doing experiments in a besieged city because they had decided that understanding the natural world mattered more than which side won. Oxford was about to discover, once again, that catastrophe and creation were not opposites. They were, in this city's long experience, almost always the same thing. Chapter 7. The King's Capital, and the City That Chose a Side. On the 29th of August, 1642 AD, King Charles I rode into Oxford. He had left London 4 months earlier, after his catastrophic attempt to arrest 5 members of Parliament in January had made it clear that the capital was no longer safe for him. He had been moving between towns in the Midlands and the North, trying to raise forces, trying to find a political path that did not end in open war, finding neither with sufficient success to give him confidence. The country was sliding toward a conflict that neither side had fully chosen, and neither side knew how to stop. Oxford had advantages that were difficult to ignore. It had walls. It had a significant royalist population, particularly among the university's fellows and heads of college, who tended toward a conservative Anglican theology that aligned them with the king against what they saw as the Presbyterian radicalism of the parliamentary cause. It was close enough to London to allow communication and rapid movement, but far enough to be defensible. The road network that Alfred had used to make Oxford a burh 9 centuries earlier still made it one of the best connected towns in England. And the university, whatever its intellectual traditions of argument and independence, proved in 1642 to be overwhelmingly, almost unreservedly, loyal to the crown. This is a fact that Oxford's later self-image as a place of free inquiry and progressive reform tends to overlook. In the Civil War, Oxford chose a side, and it chose the losing side, with a commitment and enthusiasm that went well beyond what either prudence or principle strictly required. The colleges donated their silver plate to be melted down for the king's war chest. The fellows who were of military age enlisted. The university's administrative structures were repurposed to support the royal war effort. Oxford was not simply occupied by the king's forces. It became, in the fullest sense, the royalist capital of England. Charles established his court at Christ Church. The great Tom Quad, designed to impress visiting dignitaries with the power and elegance of royal patronage, became the centre of a wartime government conducting the business of a kingdom under siege. Magdalen College became an artillery park. New college cloisters were used as a magazine for gunpowder. The meadows and gardens of the colleges were converted to food production. The Bodleian Library, one of the greatest concentrations of knowledge in the English-speaking world, found itself in a city that had become a military headquarters. The transformation was remarkably rapid. Within weeks of Charles's arrival, the city had acquired all the characteristics of a functioning royal court. Ministers of state conducted their business. Diplomatic negotiations were carried out. The Royal Mint, relocated from London, began producing the coinage that would fund the royalist war effort. The streets that had housed scholars and merchants were now full of soldiers, courtiers, and the hundreds of servants and tradespeople that a functioning royal court required. The population of Oxford roughly doubled in the early years of the Civil War. The housing stock was entirely inadequate for this influx. Soldiers were billeted on the town's residents, whether those residents wanted them or not. Food prices rose sharply. Disease spread through the overcrowded streets. Picture what this meant for an ordinary Oxford resident. a baker on St. Aldate's, say, who had supplied bread to the colleges for a decade, who knew his customers by name, who had a wife and 3 children in 2 rooms above the shop. In the autumn of 1642, soldiers arrived in his neighborhood. 2 were quartered in his home without asking. They ate his food and left muddy boots by his fire, and kept his children awake with noise at hours when working families slept. His supply lines were disrupted. The grain that normally arrived from the villages around Oxford was being requisitioned for the garrison. The prices he could charge were controlled by military order. The customers he had served for years had either left the city or had no money to spend. He had not voted to become the center of a civil war. He had no power to leave. He endured it with the resigned practicality of people who understood that history was happening around them, whether they consented to it or not. The university's enthusiasm for the royal cause was not entirely universal. There were men within the colleges who had parliamentary sympathies and who kept those sympathies quiet while the king's soldiers were in the quad. And outside the college walls, in the streets and workshops and markets of the town, parliamentary sentiment was more widespread than the royalist narrative of wartime Oxford acknowledges. The distinction between town and gown, which had shaped Oxford's internal life since the 13th century, took on a new political dimension during the Civil War. The university was royalist. The town was more divided. The 2 Oxfords that would persist in one form or another for the next 4 centuries were already visible in the alignment of the 1640s. The military situation shifted slowly but persistently against the king. The Battle of Marston Moor in June of 1644 AD, fought on a plateau west of York, was a decisive parliamentary and Scottish victory that effectively ended royalist control of the north of England. The Battle of Naseby in June of 1645 AD, in which the king's main field army was destroyed by the new model army under Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell, effectively ended the royalist cause in the field. After Naseby, Charles was a king without an army. He remained in Oxford. The city's walls were still intact, but the mathematics of the situation were not difficult to calculate. The city was not going to be relieved. The garrison could not fight its way out. The food supplies that sustained the increasingly crowded population were being consumed faster than they could be replenished. Here is the detail that tells you most about the nature of Oxford, even in the extremity of a lost war. In the autumn of 1645 AD, with parliamentary forces tightening their grip on the city and the royalist cause effectively finished, a group of men met in Oxford and conducted philosophical and scientific experiments. They were not ignoring the war. They were aware of it. Several of them had been directly involved in it. But in the colleges and halls of a city under siege, a small group of natural philosophers were doing something that they believed mattered more in the long run than the outcome of the conflict raging outside the walls. They were meeting to discuss the new experimental philosophy. The approach to understanding the natural world through observation and testing rather than through inherited authority, that Oxford's own earlier tradition had prefigured in the work of Grosseteste and Roger Bacon centuries before. The group included John Wilkins, who became warden of Wadham College in 1648 AD, and who became the central organizer of what grew into one of the most important intellectual societies in history. It included Robert Boyle, whose work on gases and pressure would establish foundational principles of chemistry. It included a young student named Christopher Wren, who would go on to rebuild London after the Great Fire of 1666, designing more than 50 churches, including St. Paul's Cathedral. This Oxford group, meeting informally at first and then with increasing regularity during and after the Civil War, was the nucleus from which the Royal Society of London was founded in 1660 AD. The Royal Society became the primary institutional home of the scientific revolution in England and one of the most important scientific organizations in the world. It was born in Oxford. In the years when Oxford was simultaneously the royalist capital of England and a city that nobody outside its walls quite controlled. Charles I left Oxford for the last time in April of 1646 AD, slipping out of the city in disguise before dawn, accompanied by only 2 companions. He had decided to surrender to the Scottish army rather than to the English Parliament, calculating that the Scots might offer him better terms. It was the kind of political calculation that had characterized his entire reign. Too clever to be simply wrong. Not quite clever enough to work. The city negotiated its surrender with the parliamentary commanders over the following weeks. The terms were relatively generous. The colleges were not to be plundered. The university's privileges were to be respected. The garrison was allowed to march out with the honours of war. Oxford had lost the conflict it had committed itself to, but it had retained its physical fabric and its institutional structure. What it could not retain, not immediately, was its character. The parliamentary authorities who took control of Oxford proceeded to do what victorious authorities typically do with educational institutions on the wrong side of a conflict. They removed the fellows and heads of college who had been most visibly committed to the royalist cause and replaced them with men more sympathetic to the parliamentary and Puritan positions. The Book of Common Prayer was banned. The ceremonial life of the colleges was suppressed. The choral traditions of the cathedral and the college chapels, which had been central to the religious and social identity of Oxford for centuries, were drastically curtailed. Walk into one of those college chapels in the late 1640s, and you would find something almost unrecognizable compared with what had been there before. The altar gone, replaced by a plain table. The vestments stripped away. The choral music silenced. The elaborate liturgical calendar that had structured the academic year still marked the seasons, but was now emptied of the ceremonial content that had given it texture and meaning. The physical space of the chapel had not changed. The life that had filled it had been removed. The physical damage to Oxford's collections was less severe than it might have been. Parliament had enough respect for Oxford's libraries to prevent systematic destruction. The Bodleian survived intact. The college libraries survived. The manuscripts and printed books that represented centuries of accumulated scholarship were not burned. The institution had lost its governance and its ceremonial identity. It had not lost its mind. Then came 1660 AD. The restoration of Charles II was greeted in Oxford with a relief that was entirely genuine and not entirely rational. The king who came back was a different kind of man from his father. More cynical, more politically flexible, more willing to manage contradictions rather than resolve them. He had spent years in exile in France and the Netherlands and knew from direct experience what it meant to lose everything. He was not going to make his father's mistake. His relationship with Oxford was warm and became warmer. The university had suffered for his family's cause. It had educated the men who ran his government. It was producing, in the 1660s and 1670s, some of the most important intellectual work in England. The restoration of royal favour brought with it a restoration of the university's confidence, its traditional practices, and its sense of itself as the primary intellectual institution of the English-speaking world. The Sheldonian Theatre, designed by Christopher Wren and completed in 1669 AD, was the first major building commissioned after the Restoration, and in some ways the purest architectural expression of what Oxford wanted to say about itself in those years. It was not a religious building. It was not a college. It was a ceremonial hall for the university's official occasions. Built in the style of a classical Roman theatre, because Oxford, in the 1660s, was self-consciously aligning itself with the tradition of classical learning that the Renaissance had revived and that the Civil War had disrupted. Wren was 30 years old when he designed it. His design, based on the theatre of Marcellus in Rome, as described in a book rather than as seen in person, was not quite correct in all its classical proportions. It did not matter. The Sheldonian was magnificent. And standing in its interior today, looking up at the painted ceiling and out through windows that frame the Oxford skyline, you are standing in the room where Oxford decided to tell the world it was still here. Robert Boyle was at work on the experiments that would produce Boyle's law. The relationship between the pressure and volume of a gas. John Locke, a student and later a fellow of Christ Church, was beginning to develop the political philosophy that would argue for natural rights, for government by consent, and for the right of revolution against tyranny. His Two Treatises of Government, published in 1689 AD, would shape the thinking of the American founders nearly a century later. Thomas Willis, working at Oxford in the 1660s, was producing the most detailed and accurate description of the human brain yet written. All of this was happening in the same city, in the same decades, in colleges that had melted their silver plate for a king who had lost. The royalist capital had become, in the generation after its defeat, one of the most important intellectual centers of the English-speaking world. Not because of the war, not despite the war, because of what Oxford did with the years that followed it, because a group of men decided, in a besieged city in 1645, that understanding the natural world was more important than which side won. And because they were right, that capacity to absorb catastrophe and turn it into something unexpected is perhaps the most distinctive thing about this city. Oxford does not simply survive what is thrown at it. It has a habit, persistent across 9 centuries, of producing its most consequential work in the shadow of its worst disasters. Chapter 8. Enlightenment, Empire, and the Long Sleep. There is a sentence in the memoirs of Edward Gibbon, one of the greatest historians the English language has produced, that Oxford has never quite recovered from. Gibbon arrived at Magdalen College in 1752 AD at the age of 14. Intellectually precocious, hungry to learn, possessed of the kind of serious curiosity about history and ideas that should have made Oxford exactly the right place for him. He had been reading voraciously since childhood. He wanted to argue. He wanted to be challenged by minds better than his own. What he found at Magdalen, he later wrote in his memoirs, was 14 months that he would remember as the most idle and unprofitable of his whole life. His tutor, he wrote in his own words, had absolved himself from the toil of reading or thinking or writing. The Fellows of Magdalen were decent, easy men who contentedly enjoyed the gifts of the founder, an institution that had forgotten why it existed. Gibbon's account is not a neutral document. He was writing with the clarity of hindsight and the sharpness of a man who had found his intellectual formation elsewhere, in Lausanne, under a Swiss tutor who actually taught him things. But the portrait he paints is corroborated by enough other sources to be taken seriously as a description of what Oxford had become by the middle of the 18th century. Here is what had happened, and it is worth understanding clearly because it explains something about institutions that goes well beyond Oxford. The fellowships that sustained the university's teaching staff had been endowed in the medieval and Tudor periods with the intention of supporting serious scholars. By the 18th century, the world had changed considerably. The careers that intelligent, ambitious young men wanted had multiplied. The subjects those careers required had expanded, and the fellows of Oxford's colleges, protected by their endowments from the competitive pressures that force institutions to adapt, had very little incentive to change anything about the way they operated. Many Oxford fellowships were restricted by their original statutes to men from specific geographic areas or specific family backgrounds. A fellowship at All Souls College required the holder to be celibate. Other fellowships were constrained by rules that had made practical sense in the 15th century and had become, by the 18th, mechanisms for distributing comfortable incomes to men who met narrowly defined criteria, rather than mechanisms for identifying and supporting the best scholars. Imagine a fellow like Thomas Wilson, a name that would not be unusual in the college records of this period. He obtained his fellowship at a medium-sized college in the 1730s through the combination of the right family connections and the right geographic origin. He spent the following 20 years drawing his stipend, eating his dinners in the college hall, and producing almost nothing of intellectual consequence. He was not unintelligent. He was not lazy by the standards of a society that considered leisure a mark of gentlemanly status. He simply had no structure that required him to do more than the minimum, and no competition that rewarded doing more. The endowment that Walter de Merton had designed 4 centuries earlier to liberate scholars from financial anxiety had, in his generation, become a mechanism for liberating certain men from the requirement to do any scholarship at all. Men like Thomas Wilson were often graduates of the same Oxford colleges that employed them, and many of them went on to serve as administrators in the expanding colonial empire, carrying with them the particular brand of confident incuriosity that Oxford, at its worst, cultivated. They were not, in most cases, deliberately cruel, or even consciously ideological. They simply carried with them the unexamined assumptions of a world that Oxford had built. Assumptions about who was capable of self-governance, who deserved the protections of law, who counted as fully civilized in the relevant sense. Those assumptions, transmitted through the educational culture of 18th century Oxford, shaped how Britain's empire was administered in ways that had real consequences for tens of millions of people who had no say in the matter. Gibbon was not the only significant figure to leave an unflattering account of the institution. Adam Smith, who had been a student at Balliol College in the 1740s before going on to become the founding theorist of modern economics, wrote in The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776 AD, that the professors at Oxford had for some time given up altogether even the pretense of teaching. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, had been a fellow at Lincoln College in the 1720s and 30s and had found the intellectual and spiritual atmosphere so unsatisfying that he formed his own small study group, the Holy Club, whose rigorous approach to personal discipline and serious study earned its members the mocking nickname of Methodists. These were not marginal figures complaining about peripheral failures. They were among the most important thinkers that 18th century Britain produced, and they were telling the same story about the same institution. While Oxford dozed, the intellectual work transforming the Western world was happening elsewhere. Cambridge was producing work in mathematics and natural philosophy that built on Newton's foundations. Edinburgh was becoming the most dynamic centre of medical education in the world. Glasgow was the intellectual home of Adam Smith. The Scottish Enlightenment was generating ideas about economics, history, and philosophy that would shape the modern world far more directly than anything coming out of Oxford's common rooms. Then, in 1844 AD, something happened that the university had been dreading. The railway arrived. The Great Western Railway had been building its line westward from London since the late 1830s, and by 1844 it had reached Oxford, connecting the ancient university town to the capital in a journey time of around 90 minutes. In most places, this would have been welcomed as straightforward progress. In Oxford, it produced something close to institutional panic. The heads of the colleges were deeply uneasy. Their stated concerns were partly practical, involving noise and smoke near ancient buildings. But the concerns they were less willing to state publicly were social. The railway would bring to Oxford, quickly and cheaply, exactly the kind of people that the university did not want there. Working men, tradespeople, political radicals, people who had no connection to the university and no reason to treat it with the deference the institution expected. One contemporary account records a college official remarking that the railway would introduce a very undesirable class of visitor to the neighborhood. The university lobbied for the station to be placed as far from the city center as possible. It argued for restrictions on Sunday trains. It expressed, in various ways, its fundamental preference that Oxford remain the kind of place people came to by carriage from the right kind of background, not by train from anywhere. They lost. The railway came. The transformation it brought was real and irreversible, connecting Oxford to the wider social and economic life of Britain in ways that made the university's attempt to exist as a self-contained world of scholarship and privilege less sustainable with each passing year. The Royal Commission that investigated Oxford and Cambridge in 1850 AD found what Gibbon and Adam Smith had described a century earlier: an institution in which many fellowships were filled by men who were not teaching. Many statutes were being honored in ways that defeated their original purposes, and the educational experience of most students bore little relationship to the serious intellectual work that the university's reputation implied. The Commission's report was detailed and impossible to dismiss. The University Reform Act of 1854 AD began the dismantling of the old system. It broke the requirement that fellows be celibate and take holy orders in the Church of England. It opened the possibility of appointing professors on merit rather than through the patronage and restrictive criteria that had governed appointments for centuries. A second University Reform Act, in 1877 AD, went further, removing more of the restrictive statutes and expanding the range of subjects that Oxford could seriously teach. The process of reform was slow, uneven, and bitterly resisted at every stage by those who benefited from the existing arrangements. What drove it was not the benevolence of Oxford's existing members. What drove it was the combination of external political pressure and the simple competitive reality that other institutions were doing things Oxford was not doing and producing results that Oxford could not match. There is an irony worth noting here. The very sleepiness that had made the institution such a target of criticism had also, in a perverse way, preserved something important. The ancient buildings that Victorians began restoring and celebrating in the second half of the 19th century had survived, partly because Oxford had been too torpid to knock them down and replace them with something more modern. The medieval street plan, the college gardens, the libraries, with their accumulated centuries of books, had persisted through Oxford's long sleep in a way they might not have survived a period of energetic modernization. Oxford was waking up, and in waking up, it was discovering that the questions it had avoided for a century, about who it was for and who it served, were not going to wait much longer for an answer. Chapter 9: Reform, Women, and the Making of Modern Oxford. In the autumn of 1879 AD, two new educational institutions opened in Oxford. Somerville Hall and Lady Margaret Hall admitted their first students, women who had travelled to Oxford to study the same subjects that male students studied, to sit in the same lectures as male students, to prepare for the same examinations as male students. They were not, under any circumstances, to receive the same degrees. The distinction between studying at Oxford and belonging to Oxford, between doing the work and receiving the recognition, between being present in the institution and being a member of it, would persist for the women of Somerville and Lady Margaret Hall for the next 41 years. It is worth being precise about what this meant in practice. Women could attend lectures, if the relevant professor chose to admit them, which not all did. They could sit the examinations. After sustained pressure had been applied to allow this, they could receive unofficial notification of their results. They could not matriculate. They were not formally members of the university. They could not use the Bodleian Library until 1900, and even then only under restricted conditions. They could not take degrees. They could not vote in any university governance body. They could not hold any university office. During those 41 years, women sat examinations in which they sometimes outperformed every male student in their year. Their names were not read out with the men's names at the announcement of results. Their achievements were noted in separate lists, in a system carefully designed to acknowledge that they had done the work, without conceding that the work entitled them to anything the institution normally gave. Think about what that required. Not abstractly, but personally. A woman arrives in Oxford, perhaps from a family that has scraped together the fees, perhaps on a scholarship, having already cleared hurdles that most of her male counterparts never faced. She studies through the same terms, writes the same essays, sits the same examinations. She finishes. The results are announced. The men's names are read aloud. Hers is noted elsewhere, in a document that confirms she performed at a certain level, without telling the world what that level was relative to the men who were being formally recognized. She did this not for a year or two, but for the entirety of her Oxford career, and she came back the following year, and the year after that, because the alternative was to concede that the institution's refusal to recognize her was justified. The formal admission of women to full membership of the university, with the right to matriculate and receive degrees, finally came in 1920 AD, when the vote in congregation, the university's governing body, finally passed. It ended a campaign that had lasted 41 years. The first women to receive Oxford degrees did so on the 14th of October, 1920 AD, at a ceremony in the Sheldonian Theatre. Some of those women had been waiting a very long time. Edith Morley, who received her doctorate at that ceremony, had first sat the equivalent examination in 1899 AD. 21 years earlier, she was 51 years old when Oxford gave her the degree she had earned before she was 30. Whatever she felt standing in the Sheldonian that October morning was something the institution had no right to call generosity. But even 1920 was not the full story. The admission of women to degrees did not mean the admission of women to the existing colleges. The old men's colleges remained exclusively male. The first men's college to admit women was Wadham. In 1974 AD, the last was Oriel, which finally admitted women in 1985 AD. 65 years after women had formally been admitted to the university. The pattern of which colleges held out longest is not random. The colleges that most fiercely resisted the admission of women were, in general, the colleges with the most prestigious social reputations and the strongest connections to the traditional ruling class. The resistance was not primarily about protecting academic standards. It was about protecting a social environment that a specific kind of man had been accustomed to inhabiting, without having to consider the presence or the perspectives of women. The story of women at Oxford is one of the clearest illustrations of a pattern that runs throughout the institution's history. Oxford changes when it has no choice left. It holds on to existing arrangements until the intellectual and moral case for them has collapsed so completely that continued defense becomes embarrassing. And then, having finally changed, it tends to present the change as evidence of its own enlightened values, rather than as the belated concession to pressure that it actually was. While the question of women's place in Oxford was being fought out across these decades, the institution was simultaneously undergoing a transformation in its intellectual scope that was more radical than anything since the 13th century. The reform of the curriculum that began after 1854 created new degree subjects in natural science, modern history, and law. The sciences were given institutional homes. Laboratories were built. The Museum of Natural History, opened in 1860 AD, provided laboratory space for the growing community of natural scientists. 1 week after the museum's formal opening, a public debate was held at the British Association for the Advancement of Science meeting in Oxford on the 30th of June, 1860. The subject was Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, published the previous year in On the Origin of Species. The debate between Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford, and the biologist Thomas Henry Huxley has become one of the defining public confrontations over evolution in the 19th century. Before describing what was said, it is worth being clear about what the historical record actually shows. The accounts written by participants and witnesses differ in significant details, and the specific words that each man used have been contested by historians since the event itself. What seems clear from the most careful historical analysis is that a sharp exchange occurred, that Wilberforce challenged Huxley in a way that Huxley found an opportunity to rebut with considerable force, and that the audience response was divided and intense. The version of events in which Wilberforce asked whether Huxley was descended from an ape on his grandfather's or his grandmother's side, and in which Huxley replied that he would rather be descended from an ape than from a man who used his intellect to obscure the truth, comes from accounts written years after the event, and is treated by historians as a dramatic reconstruction that may capture the spirit of the exchange without being a verbatim record. What is not in doubt is that the debate happened, and that it happened here. The Oxford Union produced, in February of 1933 AD, one of the most debated student votes of the 20th century. The undergraduates who voted on the motion that this house will in no circumstances fight for its king and country were not, for the most part, simple pacifists or cowards. Many of them were the sons of men who had died in the First World War. Several of them would fight in the Second World War 6 years later, and some of them would die in it. The motion passed by 275 votes to 153. It was reported internationally, condemned by conservative politicians, and argued over for years. The question of whether it actually influenced anyone's strategic calculations is one that historians treat with considerable caution, finding little evidence to support confident claims in either direction. What it illuminates clearly is the generation who voted it. Young people shaped by the long shadow of the previous war, trying to say something about obligation and sacrifice that the available political language did not fully accommodate. The Oxford of this period was also, in ways that its official histories have been slow to acknowledge, deeply implicated in the ideology of empire. The Rhodes Scholarships, established under the will of Cecil Rhodes, who died in 1902 AD, brought students from the British Empire, the United States, and Germany to Oxford with the explicit intention of training leaders who would extend what Rhodes called Anglo-Saxon civilization across the world. Oxford accepted his money and his students without seriously interrogating the ideology that accompanied them. The decision not to interrogate that ideology would return to the institution with considerable force more than a century later. The Oxford that entered the 20th century was a more genuinely serious intellectual institution than it had been when Gibbon arrived at Magdalen in 1752. It was also still, in fundamental ways, an institution organized around the assumption that its primary constituency was a specific kind of person from a specific kind of background. The catastrophe of 1914 was about to test whether that character could survive what was coming. Chapter 10. War, Penicillin, and the city that saved millions. On the 4th of August, 1914 AD, Britain declared war on Germany. In Oxford, as in every university town in Britain, the declaration was met with a response that later generations would find difficult to fully comprehend. The students and young fellows who had been arguing about philosophy and reading Greek texts and rowing on the Cherwell in the long summer evenings did not wait to be conscripted. They volunteered. They walked into the recruiting offices in large numbers. In the first weeks and months of the war, with a combination of patriotic conviction and a genuine inability to imagine what they were volunteering for, Within weeks of the declaration, the colleges began to empty. The undergraduates left. The younger fellows left. The tutorial rooms that had been filled with the steady rhythm of academic argument fell quiet. Examination schools. The large Victorian building on the High Street, where students sat their final examinations, was converted into a military hospital. Merton College's garden was used for officer training. University parks became a drilling ground. Walk through almost any Oxford college today and find the memorial to those who died in the First World War. They are usually prominently placed, often in the entrance to the college chapel or in the main quadrangle. Read the names. Count them. At New College, the memorial lists 149 names. At Christ Church, 197. Balliol lost 107. Magdalen lost 100. These are not percentages of a large national army. These are individuals known to their colleges, known to each other, gone in 4 years. The men who died were, by selection, among the most able of their generation. They were the people who would have become the next generation of scholars, scientists, politicians, and public thinkers. Oxford, after the war, was an institution trying to rebuild its intellectual community with a generation partially missing. The way a piece of music tries to continue after several of its instruments have been silenced mid-phrase. Between the wars, Oxford became something it had never quite been before. The rise of fascism in Germany after 1933 AD produced a wave of intellectual emigration that transformed several British institutions, and Oxford received a significant share of it. Jewish scholars from German and Austrian universities, physicists and chemists and historians and philosophers whose careers had been destroyed by the Nazi racial laws, found positions at Oxford. They brought with them the methodological traditions of Central European scholarship, which tended to be more systematically rigorous than the English academic culture they were joining. The cross-fertilization that resulted was genuinely enriching. Albert Einstein was offered a studentship at Christ Church in 1933 AD when he left Germany. He declined, choosing to go to Princeton instead. The offer itself was significant. Oxford was positioning itself as a place of refuge for exactly the kind of mind that fascism was trying to destroy. Then came the thing that happened in a laboratory on South Parks Road in Oxford in 1940 AD, which is less famous than it should be, and which changed the history of medicine more profoundly than almost any other single discovery in the 20th century. To tell this story properly, you have to start not in Oxford, but in a laboratory in London in 1928 AD, where a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming noticed something unusual in a petri dish he had been about to discard. Fleming had been growing cultures of Staphylococcus bacteria, the kind responsible for a wide range of serious infections. The dish had become contaminated by accident with a mold called Penicillium notatum, and the mold had done something that Fleming immediately recognized as remarkable. Around the contaminated area, the bacteria were dead. The mold was producing something that killed them. Fleming published his observations in 1929 AD. He called the substance produced by the mold penicillin. He noted its antibacterial properties. But because he was a bacteriologist rather than a chemist, and because the problem of extracting and purifying the active substance from the mold in sufficient quantities to be medically useful was a chemistry problem of considerable difficulty, he moved on to other work. Penicillin sat in the scientific literature for a decade. Noted, cited occasionally, and not developed. In 1939 AD, Howard Florey, an Australian-born pathologist who had become professor of pathology at Oxford, decided that a systematic review of naturally occurring antibacterial substances was worth undertaking. He assembled a team that included Ernst Chain, a German Jewish biochemist who had fled to Britain in 1933 AD, exactly the kind of refugee scholar that Oxford had been welcoming in those years. Chain reviewed Fleming's paper on penicillin and identified it as the most promising of the substances worth investigating. Over the next 2 years, working in a laboratory in the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology on South Parks Road, Florey and Chain and their team solved the chemistry problem that Fleming had set aside. They found a way to extract and purify penicillin in sufficient quantities and sufficient purity to test its effects. The first test was conducted in May of 1940 AD on 8 mice infected with lethal doses of streptococcal bacteria. 4 of the mice received injections of penicillin. 4 received nothing. By the following morning, the 4 untreated mice were dead. The 4 treated mice were alive and healthy. The result was so clear, so unambiguous, so unlike the ambiguous and provisional findings that most biological experiments produce, that those who witnessed it understood immediately they were looking at something unprecedented. They had not merely confirmed that penicillin worked in laboratory conditions. They had demonstrated, with unmistakable force, that an infectious disease that killed without treatment could be stopped by a substance that a mold produced. The first human trial took place in February of 1941 AD. A police constable named Albert Alexander, who was dying of a severe bacterial infection that had spread from a small scratch and become life-threatening, was given injections of the small quantity of penicillin the Oxford team had been able to produce. According to the contemporary clinical records of the case, he improved dramatically within 24 hours. He continued to improve for 4 days. Then the supply of penicillin ran out. The team tried to recover penicillin from his urine, filtering and reusing it. But there was not enough. Albert Alexander died in March of 1941 AD. He died not because penicillin did not work. He died because Oxford, in 1941 AD, could not produce it in sufficient quantities to complete his treatment. The problem was scaling up. The Oxford laboratory could produce enough penicillin for mice and for a few human trials. It could not produce enough to treat the hundreds of thousands of infected soldiers and civilians who needed it. The industrial capacity required to produce penicillin at scale did not exist in Britain in 1941. And Britain in 1941 was not in a position to build it. In the summer of 1941 AD, Howard Florey flew to the United States. He carried samples of the penicillin-producing mold with him, taking careful precautions to protect the material during the journey. He met with the United States Department of Agriculture and with pharmaceutical companies. He explained what penicillin was and what it could do. The Americans, not yet in the war but clearly moving toward it, understood immediately the military significance of an antibiotic that could prevent the infected wounds that had been among the major causes of death in every previous conflict. American pharmaceutical companies and government laboratories threw resources at the scaling problem that British industry could not match. By 1943 AD, penicillin was being produced in quantities sufficient to treat military casualties on a significant scale. By 1944 AD, it was available in sufficient quantities to treat Allied forces during the Normandy landings. Soldiers who would have died from infected wounds in every previous war survived because of what Howard Florey had carried across the Atlantic. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for 1945 AD was awarded jointly to Alexander Fleming, Howard Florey, and Ernst Chain. Fleming received the larger share of the public credit, partly because his original observation was the starting point, and partly because he was a more visible public figure than Florey, who was private and uncomfortable with celebrity. The inequality of recognition between Fleming's discovery and Florey's development of that discovery into an actual medicine is one of the minor injustices in the history of science. The work that turned penicillin from an interesting laboratory observation into a medicine was done at Oxford, by a team that included a refugee from Nazi Germany, working during the years when Britain was fighting for its survival. By most assessments, This work belongs among the most consequential acts of applied science in human history, and various estimates in the scientific literature suggest penicillin has saved tens of millions of lives since its widespread introduction, with some estimates running considerably higher, though the precise figure depends on methodology and assumptions that different researchers approach differently. Oxford had not been bombed during the Second World War. The most persistent explanation offered by historians for this, though one that is difficult to prove definitively from the surviving record, is that German planning documents considered preserving certain English cities as potential administrative centres in the event of a successful invasion, and Oxford's combination of facilities and symbolic weight may have factored into targeting decisions. This explanation should be treated as a persistent hypothesis rather than a confirmed fact. What is confirmed is that Oxford's buildings and collections survived the war intact, while many British cities of comparable cultural significance did not. The city that emerged from the Second World War was not the Oxford that had entered it. The war had demonstrated that the kind of work done in Oxford laboratories had consequences that extended far beyond the university's traditional social constituency. Penicillin did not save the lives of any particular class or group. It saved the lives of everyone who could receive it. That universality was not entirely comfortable for an institution that had historically defined itself through exclusivity. And in the decades that followed, the other Oxford that had been building itself outside the university's walls would make that discomfort impossible to ignore. Chapter 11. Protest, Car Factories, and the Fractured City. Drive southeast from the centre of Oxford, past the ancient colleges and the Victorian museums and the Bodleian Library, past the ring road that marks the boundary of the old city, and you reach a neighbourhood called Cowley. Cowley does not look like Oxford. It does not have dreaming spires, or honey-coloured stone, or quadrangles, where scholars walk in quiet conversation. It has terraced houses built in the early 20th century for workers who needed somewhere affordable to live. It has a high street with the shops that serve a working population. It has a mosque and a Polish supermarket and a Caribbean community centre, and the particular texture of a place that has been absorbing people for generations. The family at the centre of this part of Oxford's story is a composite, based on documented migration patterns in post-war Cowley. Call them the Josephs. Winston and Myrtle Joseph arrived from Jamaica in 1957 AD, drawn by the same advertisements that brought thousands of Caribbean workers to British industrial towns in those years. Winston had been a mechanic in Kingston. He found work at the Cowley plant assembling cars. Myrtle found work in a local laundry and later in a hospital kitchen. They rented a room, finding, as many Caribbean arrivals did, that landlords posted signs reading, "No Irish," "No coloureds in their windows," and navigating accordingly until they found a family willing to take them in on the next street. They had 2 children born in Oxford. Those children grew up as English children, going to English schools, speaking with English accents, knowing no other country. The plant where Winston worked was the Morris Motor Company, founded by William Morris, who had grown up in Oxford as the son of a farm labourer, opened a bicycle repair shop on the High Street in 1893 AD at the age of 16, and by 1912 had produced his first motor car, the Morris Oxford. In a converted military training college at Cowley, Morris understood something that his competitors were slower to grasp. He applied assembly line methods to British manufacturing and produced cars at prices that brought them within reach of the middle class for the first time. The Cowley factory expanded repeatedly. By the 1950s, it was one of the largest employers in southern England, producing hundreds of thousands of vehicles each year and employing tens of thousands of workers. These 2 Oxfords, the ancient university city and the industrial suburb, occupied the same municipal boundaries and shared some of the same physical infrastructure. They did not share the same social world, the same economic prospects, or the same relationship to the institutions that gave Oxford its global reputation. The Josephs and families like them were essential to the economic life of Cowley, and therefore to the economic life of the wider city. They were largely invisible to most of the people whose careers and intellectual lives were centered on the university, 3 miles to the northwest. The 1960s brought to Oxford, as to most Western universities, the political energy of a generation questioning the social structures that the post-war settlement had left intact. The occupation of the Clarendon Building in 1970 AD by students protesting Oxford's financial investments in South Africa, at a time when South Africa was enforcing apartheid with increasing violence, was one of the more significant of these events. The university responded with a combination of limited concession and institutional absorption that was characteristic of how Oxford handled challenges to its established practices. Some investments were reviewed. A process was created. The immediate pressure was partially relieved without the fundamental question being resolved. But in the 1970s, the most disruptive change happening to Oxford was not political protest. It was economic. The British car industry, which had been the engine of Cowley's prosperity since the 1920s, was entering a crisis from which it would never fully recover. The combination of management failures, labor dispute, underinvestment in new technology, and increasingly fierce competition from German and Japanese manufacturers was destroying the competitiveness of British vehicle production in ways that no amount of political will or industrial negotiation seemed able to reverse. Winston Joseph was laid off from the Cowley plant in 1978 AD, when the plant reduced its workforce in the first round of cuts that would continue through the following decade. He found other work, eventually in construction and then in a warehouse. Less pay, less security. The social world organized around the factory. The union meetings and the Friday evenings with workmates and the collective identity of being part of something that made something real and visible. That world contracted and then largely disappeared. His children, the ones who had grown up as English children, knowing no other country, found themselves inheriting an economy that had less room for them than the one their parents had arrived in. Margaret Thatcher had studied chemistry at Somerville College, Oxford, in the 1940s. In 1985 AD, the university voted on whether to award her an honorary degree. The voting congregation was 738 against the degree and 319 in favour. It was the first time in living memory that Oxford had refused an honorary degree to a sitting British Prime Minister who had studied there. The stated reasons centred on damage to university funding and to British science under her government. This was a genuine grievance, expressed in genuine terms. But the vote was also a political act by an institution that disagreed strongly with the direction the country was being taken. And the political fallout was real, though its precise effects on subsequent funding decisions are difficult to establish with certainty. The Oxford of the 1980s was an institution in the middle of a transformation from a somewhat exclusive training ground for the British establishment into something more genuinely open, more intellectually diverse, and more explicitly competitive in a global market for students and scholars, while simultaneously being embedded in a city that was experiencing the dislocation of deindustrialization and the social strains that dislocation produced. The physics department was doing work that would contribute to multiple Nobel Prizes. The chemistry department was producing research that was changing the understanding of molecular biology. The medical school was producing clinicians and researchers whose work was changing the practice of medicine worldwide. And in the streets and neighborhoods around the university, the children and grandchildren of the workers who had built the other Oxford were navigating a transition that nobody had planned for them. Winston and Myrtle's children had university-educated friends. They had grown up in a city with one of the world's great universities as its most visible institution. One of them went to university in London. The other became a nurse. They built lives that were genuinely middle-class lives. In a city whose housing market was becoming one of the most expensive in Britain outside London, they paid rent that ate a quarter of their salaries. They commuted from neighbourhoods their parents had moved to when central Oxford became unaffordable. The physical division of Oxford between a prosperous centre connected to the university and a struggling periphery connected to the declining industrial economy was becoming, as the 20th century ended, increasingly visible and increasingly entrenched. The transformation enriched some parts of Oxford and left others behind in ways that were plain to see on any drive from the city centre to the Ring Road and beyond. The 21st century would force a confrontation between these two Oxfords that the 20th century had managed to defer. And when it arrived, it would reveal something that both Oxfords had always known, but rarely said directly. The city had never really decided what it was for. It had only ever decided, repeatedly, what it was not yet willing to change. Chapter 12. Oxford, Today. The Idea Factory in the Age of Doubt. There is a moment. If you walk down Broad Street in Oxford on a clear morning, when you pass over a small cross set into the road surface, most people walk over it without noticing. It marks the place where Latimer and Ridley and Cranmer were burned in the 1500s. 470 years of history compressed into a cross in the pavement that people step over on their way to get coffee. That compression of time is the thing about Oxford that visitors feel and struggle to articulate. The distance between the very old and the very present is shorter here than in almost any other city in the world. And nowhere was that compression more dramatically demonstrated than in the events of 2020 AD. In March of 2020, the British government announced a national lockdown in response to a novel coronavirus that had begun spreading globally from Wuhan, China. In late 2019, Oxford, like every other city, fell quiet. The streets that are normally busy with tourists from every part of the world became empty. The colleges, which had been open in various forms for the better part of 900 years, closed their gates. It was the most complete suspension of normal university life since the wartime closures and evacuations of the 1940s. The silence was different from any previous silence in Oxford's history. Not the silence of a besieged city holding its breath. Not the silence of plague-emptied streets. The silence of a city that had been made for human gathering and human encounter. Suddenly and completely without both. But in a building on the old road in Headington, on the eastern edge of Oxford, something was already happening that would end the silence sooner than most people dared to hope. The Jenner Institute, a vaccine research centre affiliated with the University of Oxford, had been developing a vaccine platform based on a modified chimpanzee adenovirus that could be adapted quickly to new pathogens. When the genetic sequence of the coronavirus was published in January of 2020 AD, the team, led by Professor Sarah Gilbert, began work on a vaccine within days. The speed of what followed was without precedent in the history of vaccine development. Within months of the pandemic's declaration, the Oxford team had moved from initial design through manufacturing and into human clinical trials. The partnership with the pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca, announced in April of 2020 AD, provided the industrial manufacturing capacity that Howard Florey had been forced to seek in America 80 years earlier, when the Oxford Penicillin laboratory could not produce enough of the drug to save its first patient. The parallel was not lost on the people who knew both stories. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was authorized for use in Britain on the 30th of December 2020 AD, less than a year after the pandemic had been declared. It was among the first vaccines authorized anywhere in the world. Independent researchers subsequently published analyses suggesting it represented one of the most significant public health interventions in the history of vaccination. Though, as with any assessment of complex interventions in a global pandemic, the precise quantification involves considerable methodological debate. The pattern was one that Oxford had enacted before: a crisis, a laboratory, scientists working with urgency under difficult conditions, a discovery that extended far beyond the institution's walls and reached people that the institution had never been designed to serve. Florey and penicillin in 1940, Gilbert and the coronavirus vaccine in 2020, 80 years apart. The same South Park's Road spirit, the same Oxford, but the vaccine story, unlike the penicillin story, played out in a media environment that could scrutinize every decision in real time. And the decisions that accompanied it were not uniformly praised. The agreement between Oxford and AstraZeneca had been structured, partly at the insistence of the British government, to ensure that the vaccine would be supplied at cost to low and middle-income countries. This was intended to ensure global accessibility rather than restricting the vaccine to wealthy countries that could afford market prices. In practice, the distribution was unequal in ways that the cost agreement did not fully prevent. Manufacturing bottlenecks, export restrictions by national governments, and the competitive pressures of a global emergency combined to produce a situation in which wealthy countries were vaccinated months before the poorest ones. The disparity was not Oxford's creation, and it was not within Oxford's power to fully correct. But it was a visible illustration of the gap between the ideals that institutions like Oxford articulate and the realities of the world in which those ideals are implemented. Oxford had done something extraordinary. The world had not been quite equal to it. That gap became most visible during these same years, in the debate over a statue on the facade of Oriel College, facing the High Street. A stone figure of Cecil Rhodes stands in a niche above the college entrance. Rhodes had donated money to Oriel in the 1880s. He had later made Oxford a central beneficiary of the fortune he accumulated in southern Africa through the Kimberley diamond mines and through the political and military operations that established British control over what became Rhodesia, present-day Zimbabwe and Zambia. The Rhodes Scholarships, funded from his estate, had been bringing outstanding students from around the world to Oxford since 1903 AD. In 2015 AD, a student movement at the University of Cape Town successfully campaigned for the removal of a Rhodes statue from its campus, and the campaign spread to Oxford. Students and activists argued that a statue of a man who had explicitly advocated white supremacy and who had used wealth accumulated through the exploitation of African labor to fund an institution that honored him with a prominent architectural position, was incompatible with Oxford's claimed values of inclusion and equality. Oriel College initially indicated it was open to considering the statue's removal. Then, following significant pressure from donors who threatened to withdraw or withhold contributions, the college announced in May of 2021 AD that it would not begin the legal process required for removal, citing planning obstacles and financial costs. The decision was criticized by those who had argued for removal as evidence that donor money had more influence over Oxford's decisions than the expressed preferences of its current students, particularly its non-white students. It was defended by those who opposed removal as a principled stand against retrospective moral judgment of historical figures, and as a recognition that the Rhodes Scholarships, whatever the character of their founder, had brought genuinely exceptional students from around the world to Oxford for more than a century. Both of those arguments contain real substance. Neither of them is the whole story. The Rhodes statue debate is not a simple question with a clear right answer. It is a genuinely difficult question about how institutions should relate to the parts of their history that are morally troubling, about who gets to make those decisions, and about what the relationship between money and institutional independence actually looks like when it is tested by a concrete choice. What the debate revealed beyond the specific question of what to do with a particular piece of stone, was the distance that Oxford still had to travel between its stated commitment to inclusion and the reality of how it operated. Then came a quieter development, less dramatic than a statue controversy, less visible than a vaccine, but in some ways more disorienting for an institution that had defined itself for 900 years by its willingness to think seriously about the most difficult questions of each era. In 2005 AD, a philosopher named Nick Bostrom and colleagues established the Future of Humanity Institute, affiliated with the University of Oxford. It became one of the most influential centers in the world for thinking about existential risk from advanced technologies, including artificial intelligence. Its researchers published work that shaped how governments and technology companies thought about the long-term implications of AI development. Its ideas spread from Oxford to Silicon Valley and to policy circles in Washington and Brussels and Beijing. The questions the Institute was asking about what happens when AI systems become more capable than human beings, about the risks involved in building systems that can recursively improve themselves, about how humanity should think about technologies that might transform the conditions of existence more radically than any previous technology, were questions that seemed marginal to many people when the Institute opened. By the time it closed, they were among the most urgent questions in the world. On the 16th of April, 2024 AD, the Future of Humanity Institute closed. The official reasons given involved funding and administrative restructuring within the university. What is clear is that one of the world's most influential centers for thinking about the risks of advanced AI, housed at one of the world's most prestigious universities, ceased to exist at the moment when those risks were becoming a central concern of governments and technology companies around the world. New initiatives and research groups emerged to carry forward parts of the work. Oxford moved on. As institutions, as old and as complex as Oxford, always move on. But the closure raises a question that sits at the center of what Oxford is and what it is for in 2026. The institution has survived for 900 years by producing ideas that mattered, not always the right ideas, not always the timely ideas, but ideas of sufficient substance and originality that the world had reason to pay attention. The questions that matter most right now are being answered, partially and imperfectly, in laboratories and boardrooms and government offices, where the quality of the thinking is often not equal to the scale of the decisions being made. Oxford has people working on these questions. It also has, as it has always had, the competing pressures of donor relationships, government funding dependencies, commercial partnerships, and the institutional conservatism that comes from being an organization with a very long history and a very strong sense of its own importance. Whether those pressures allow the most important thinking to be done, or whether they shape the questions that get asked in ways that protect comfortable assumptions, is something that the 900 years of history we have been traveling through cannot answer. It is something that is being determined right now, in decisions being made in Oxford in 2026, by people who may not fully realize the weight of what they are deciding. Oxford in 2026 is consistently ranked among the top universities in the world by most major global rankings, sharing that position with Cambridge, MIT, Harvard, and a small number of other research universities, depending on the year and the methodology. It has more than 24,000 students. More than 40% of them are international, coming from more than 150 countries. Its annual research income exceeds £1 billion. It has produced more than 30 Nobel laureates in the sciences alone. It is also a place where the likelihood of a student from a poor family attending remains substantially lower than the likelihood of a student from a wealthy family with equivalent academic qualifications. Where the housing market, with some of the highest property prices in Britain outside London, is pricing out the nurses and teachers and delivery drivers who keep the city functioning. Where the communities of Cowley and Rose Hill and Blackbird Lays, built by the workers who made the other Oxford possible for a century, are watching their neighbourhoods change around them in ways that are not always in their interest. The children of Winston and Myrtle Joseph, if we follow their composite story to its present, are in their 60s now. One retired from nursing last year. The other runs a small business in East Oxford. Neither of them has ever been inside one of the colleges as anything other than a tourist. Their children, the third generation, are different. One of them is a doctoral student at the university, the first in the family to study here. Navigating an institution whose social codes still carry the fingerprints of a history she is simultaneously inheriting and questioning. She walks past the Martyrs' Memorial on her way to the library. She steps over the cross on Broad Street. She knows what both of them mean, and she knows that knowing what they mean is not the same as belonging to the place that made them. In the Bodleian Library, manuscripts that are older than the university itself sit in climate-controlled rooms, cared for by people whose professional commitment to their preservation represents one of the quietly admirable forms of human dedication. In the physics department, experiments are being conducted that probe the fundamental structure of matter at energies that no physicist 2 generations ago could have imagined reaching. In the medical school, clinical trials are underway for treatments of diseases that kill millions of people every year. Treatments that might, if they work, do for the 21st century what penicillin did for the 20th. In the colleges, on any given evening, students who came to Oxford from every country and every background are arguing about ideas in the way that students at Oxford have been arguing about ideas since the scholars expelled from Paris found their way to a ford on a river in 1167 AD. The argument is sometimes brilliant. It is sometimes self-indulgent. It is almost always convinced of its own importance, which is a quality that Oxford has always cultivated and that has always been both its greatest strength and its most persistent vulnerability. On Broad Street, people step over the cross in the pavement without looking down. The place where 3 men were burned for their beliefs is now a shortcut between a coffee shop and a bookstore. 900 years of history, compressed into the distance between a footstep and a cobblestone. There is a question that Oxford has never fully answered, that runs through every chapter of its long history, that surfaces in the riots of 1355 and the debates about women's degrees and the Rhodes Statue controversy and the admissions data and the housing prices and the closure of an institute that was trying to think about the future. The question is the same one that the town put to the scholars who arrived uninvited in the 12th century, and that the scholars put back to the town, and that they have been arguing about in increasingly sophisticated and increasingly unresolved forms ever since. Who is this place for? The ford is still there, under Folly Bridge, where the water moves between banks that have held it in the same channel for longer than the university has existed. The river does not answer questions. It simply continues, carrying water from the Midland Hills toward the sea and the wider world beyond. But the arguing matters. It has always mattered. 900 years ago, some scholars who had been thrown out of somewhere else found a ford and decided it was worth staying for. They argued with the town about who owned the streets. They argued with the church about who owned the truth. They argued with the crown about who owned the institution. They argued with each other about everything else. The arguing produced Penicillin, and the Book of Common Prayer, and the 2 treatises of government, and one of the defining public debates over evolution, and vaccines, and ideas about artificial intelligence that the world is still catching up with, and one student at a time, sitting in a room that is older than most nations, doing the work of thinking carefully about things that matter. The ford that oxen crossed is still there. The arguing is still going on. And if 900 years of evidence means anything at all, it means that the arguing is at least part of what makes this particular place worth crossing to reach.